Hello, welcome everyone. Salam. Thank you so much for joining us on this Wednesday evening. While so many of us are feeling deeply tender, holding so much collective rage and grief, and just welcoming you into this space and witnessing and holding that together. Before we begin, as always, we want to just make sure that folks can participate and that we've kind of held some of the access points. So I know that this is being live streamed, and that's a new experience for those who come to HDL events. We usually use Zoom. On the live stream, it's being held and you're being supported by Sara Al Saraj. And so if there's any access needs or clarifications, please do put that um, into the chat, and that the chat, as we understand, can only really be functioned or used if you're signed in. So equally, Sarah's putting in her email address, so you can email her and she's watching that live. So you have that kind of tech support or access support for folks that need it. Um, the only way to really begin this evening is to kind of open the space with intention and prayer. So I'm going to invite Pat McCabe, Woman Stands Shining, to kind of open our space with prayer. And thank you for um, offering that to this space. So Pat, over to you.
Thank you. It's an honor. Let's say, hey, ha, hey, ha, hey, ha, hey, ha. I say greetings, holy creation, all the spiritual help, all of my relations in all directions, the flying ones, swimming ones, creepy crawling ones, four-legged ones, all the waters, all the standing nation, the trees, stone people, every heart that's joined here, those hearts that we're connected to, all those ones who are conscious and aware of our meeting here. Let's reach out to you this time. Holy Mother Earth, I just ask that you take a good look here and see that some of your children are gathered here. We're putting our minds together from all parts of the world, from all parts of your body, from all of the ways that you're informing each one of us at this time. So I ask that you notice this gathering here. And I ask that you might hold us here as we come together with intention. I especially reach out to you, Mama, at this time and ask for your nurturing, for your nourishment of us. Not only the sustenance that you give us and everything that you give to us to take care of everyone we love, but nurturing in our bodies, the way our bodies are holding our empathy, our compassion, the way our bodies are holding our feelings, the way our bodies are holding our thoughts. I just ask for nurturing and nourishment, and I ask for you to inform us with your love and your way, your strength, your creativity, your beauty, your deeply, deeply relational principle, and help us feel how much we are you and you are us, and how interconnected we are. Ask that you nurture our feelings, this powerful, powerful gift that we were given to have emotion, to have feeling. Help us to understand the preciousness of this gift and the power of it. And I ask again for your nurturing presence there. And then I ask for your nurturing of our minds, the patterning of our thinking, the patterning of our beliefs. And in those places that we are not aligned with your principles, with your way, with your movement, I just ask that you might gently propose to this powerful aspect that we've been so taught to move from, that you inform that place with the nourishment of the truth of this construct. Yeah, I ask that you hold and support us at this time in this conversation. And I call on the spiritual help as well, the spirit of all the life here, the spirit beyond the physical form, to be present and to inform, to make a place for you here, to make a place for all the life here. And even between the words that are said, see this as a place to reach in to our lives, into our actions, into our thoughts, so that we can harmonize and that we can participate in this possibility of being an omnibeneficent presence as a five-fingered one. Show us that way to uphold the honor of being human beings. Show us what real love is. Show us the truth. And I ask also that you might illuminate for us how to participate fully in the very highest possibility for life and light and love. In this way, we open this meeting, this very precious time of coming together with intention for all my relations.
Thank you, Pat. As always, we want to create a little bit of a container for being in space together. So I'm going to just invite our community agreements onto the page. Some of these things won't apply, but I just wanted to draw out a few things for being in gathering together. A key one is just staying curious and open, especially for some folks where some of these ideas might be new, challenging, confronting. And so a reminder that we go hard on ideas, soft on people. I also want to pull out that lived experience and trauma. Many of us are survivors of multiple forms of harms and violence. And when we attend to these conversations or matters, they are not, they are visceral, they're tangible, they're material. And so an invitation to opt in and participate in the ways that feel appropriate for you if you need to take some time away. There will be some content there'll be content warning that might be create discomfort for folks or be activating. So just really encouraging you to attend to yourself. And we'll also put our aftercare menu at the end of the session. And then just also for these times where we need to be building powerful, robust movements and deepening in solidarities, that these are ongoing conversations. Not everything is going to feel resolved. And that we stay curious and allow our creativity to surface, and that we commit to non-performative learning in these spaces. So with that in mind, I'm just going to share for folks. I'm Fazana Khan. I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors at Healing Justice London. And at Healing Justice London, we work to create capacity for transformation that we so deeply long for and need. And we try to do that at different levels. We try to do that within and amongst our communities, especially as people who are deeply depleted, impacted by many forms of trauma and harm. We try to create that capacity on a structural level. What are the physical infrastructures that we need, from housing to food? We often call that life-affirming infrastructure because capitalism, colonialism, all the isms are against life. And so what does it mean for us to create life-affirming infrastructure that can attend to all of our aliveness, and then sustained capacity? And that's really for our movements and our grassroots spaces where most of our ideas, our genius, doesn't get to flourish and thrive because of burnout, because of lack of resource, because of conflict. And so really trying to work and stay present to the ways in which we can navigate the different forms in which we experience breakdown of our movements and our most powerful ideas and possibilities. With that in mind, I also want to just acknowledge many of us who are also attending this session are deeply impacted by what is happening in Gaza, in Palestine, in Sudan, in Haiti, in Congo. And so just taking a moment to really recognize this moment of global reckoning against multiple forms of power imbalances, imperialism, and how that's impacting us. And some of you are attending straight from action, and just also visibilizing that this at Healing Justice London with Rehearsing Freedoms, many times we've explored whether we go ahead with these sessions, do we continue having these conversations, what is the appropriate forms of action we take. And one of the reasons that we are going ahead with this conversation is because a lot of us in the global majority, our communities, our lives have experienced destruction, violation over and over again. And there is a wisdom, there is an intelligence in how we can support each other to survive, to come together, and also deepen in solidarity. And there are other ways that you can see how we are trying to pivot Rehearsing Freedoms, because we're not in a rehearsal. This is it, like we're in it. And so if you're curious about that, you can have a look on our website or our and I think I'm going to actually now invite the team to share a video about Rehearsing Freedoms, because it doesn't feel appropriate for me to share, given that we've got Marai on the call, and also I think on the live and stream, and also Alex, who have been two of the most formative people in healing justice. I often say to Marai that we are living out something you prayed for and called for. So I'm going to ask our team to share a little bit of a video about what Rehearsing Freedom is, because I think they articulate it, both Alex and Marai, on what are we attending to through Rehearsing Freedoms.
In our communities, there's often this question of how can I live outside of the system? If it's the water that I'm swimming in, how can I live outside of it? And I think Rehearsing Freedoms is a perfect way of describing the ways that we can live in ways that are completely counter to the systems that we're marginalized by. What Rehearsing Freedoms looks like in practice, we are drawing from a community of people from various lineages, treating people as experts of their own experience, opening up space for who gets to be a knowledge producer. We have completely reminded ourselves that we hold this wisdom. We hold this wisdom in our communities that we need to get free.
This is love work. Yeah? This is dream work, this is grief work, this is light work, this is shadow work. This is a practice that invites us into practice. I would love us to rehearse liberation that is attentive to our wounds and our grief. So, here's my question. Who could we be if we fell in love? If we fell in love with each other and our movements? If we played together, grieved together, and stayed through the trouble? What could our rehearsals be? What joyful, complicated freedoms could we rehearse?
What you saw there was some highlights from the first week and a half of Rehearsing Freedoms Festival, but I hope that gives you a little bit of a taster of what we are trying to practice together in this moment. I now have the great honor of inviting in our speakers. We have three speakers here tonight that inspire us deeply and whose work offers the world so much. And we'll be going with first Dr. Annabelle Showi-Mimo, who will kind of give us a lot of contextual framing, speaking really to around public health and decolonization, and whose bodies and health matters, given that Healing Justice London is works on the intersections of health and healing, and so starting in a very localized space. And then we will have Alnon Lada kind of take us into a more hybrid space of some of the ways that in which we need to dismantle the current dominant frameworks, and what are the alternative practices and ways of being and then we'll have Pat McCabe, who will bring us into vision and where we can go. For full transparency, when I asked Pat what she would like to speak on, she said, I'll move by what moves me. And so that's what's going to happen. And we move with that. So I'm going to now invite Annabelle onto the screen. And Dr. Annabelle is a doctor, academic, activist, and writer, as well as being a sexual and reproductive health registrar at the NHS. Annabelle is a co-director and founder of the charity Reproductive Justice Initiative, formerly known as Decolonizing Contraception, a freelance journalist and author of Divided Racism, Medicine, and Why We Need to Decolonize Healthcare, which has been published by the Wellcome Collection and Profile Books. Welcome, Annabelle.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen because I have some slides. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see my slides on the screen. I know not everybody likes slides. I find them quite helpful to guide me, being dyslexic. So hopefully it helps other people follow also. So I'm just going to talk about hopefully 10-15 minutes and provide a bit of context around I suppose how we conceive of bodies and who matters. I'd say that obviously over the last few weeks we've seen how this continues to play out in real time. And it's been an exceptionally challenging time for some more than others over the last week. So as said, I really look at this issue both as a healthcare provider. So I'm at the end of my sexual reproductive health training, and then also as an organizer around reproductive justice, access to abortion, access to sexual health, and then also as a researcher. And also being critical of that system. And hopefully this will come out in the Q&A more, but you know, what are the limitations of my work and my contribution within the confines of institutions and spaces. So just to give a trigger warning, that some of the things that I discuss and some of the images used do highlight racial and sexual violence, and you know, if people need to step away, mute or turn off their screen for a bit, that is absolutely fine, but I do think context is very important. So just to contextualize a lot of my work, I'm talking about anti-oppression, particularly anti-racism work, and decolonizing as a framework, which particularly over the last few years we've seen it just kind of being applied to everything, and trying to grasp whether it has a usefulness and what that usefulness will be in our movement spaces, as well as if it serves purpose within institutions, is quite at the heart of what I kind of continue to do. And, you know, we see movements around decolonizing the museum and how we go about things, and whether, you know, really we're looking for museum abolition in some cases, and actually the repatriation of materials, really. So I find this quote by Priyamvanda Gopal, hopefully I've said that correctly, I've practiced so many times over the last kind of 12 months, from an article written on decolonization and the university. And in that article, she says, decolonizing the curriculum particularly has become a keynote theme at many seminars, conferences and workshops, be both within individual disciplines and across them. At times, references to decolonizing seem so capricious as to standing for any form of critical engagement with race and representation, or indeed the mildest forms of curriculum reform. So I think this is a really important quote for me, because I think we need to keep going back to like what the purpose of some of these movements to decolonize things like the curriculum are. whether actually they're more diversity projects and who they serve in the long run. I think context is really important. So I'm very much a product of British educational institutions, particularly elite educational institutions. I did my undergraduate medical degree at UCL, which for many people they may be aware of, was quite instrumental to Colonial Project. It had sister universities like the one that my dad trained at in the University of Badon, which a lot of Nigerians know this was the sister university, but a lot of British people completely unaware that it was created in its image to kind of reinforce that idea of British education and that being the pinnacle, but also that knowledge system being put on a pedestal and local knowledge systems kind of being abandoned, essentially. And that kind of has been expunged from its history, as well as lots of other things. So I came to this work very much through doing medical anthropology and finding out about the colonial origins of medical anthropology and the history of eugenics at that institution. So Sir Francis Galton, founder of eugenics, had his eugenics lab at UCL. And I think for more people that's come to the fore in the last few years, when in 2018, in fact, a student paper uncovered that they'd been hosting a eugenics conference for the last 3 years, which they disputed it was a eugenics conference that they had no knowledge of. It was put on by one of their part-time lecturers there. However, it was clearly a eugenics conference. A lot of the papers submitted were talking about racial and sexual intellectual inferiority and trying to substantiate those claims. Now, I just think it's really important, some basic things to introduce in the kind of 5-10 minutes I've got left. So eugenics really is at the heart of a lot of our scientific thinking, and it was coined, as I said, by Francis Galton, who was also cousin to Charles Darwin, and he was very intoxicated with this idea of natural selection and the idea that we could breed a better human species essentially by rooting out those that were not fit to breed. And this was encapsulated in his final manuscript called Can't Say Where he basically just wrote a story about a eugenic utopia. And that bit of his work really has over the years been sidelined. His niece actually tried to burn or get rid of most of the manuscript because obviously, you know, eugenics has fallen out of favor for some. But the underlying premise that some people are inferior and we can stop them breeding in a multitude of ways, whether that's through population control measures, whether that's through genocide or otherwise, is obviously still a very potent idea. And these ideas are just really encapsulated in our science. So this is just one example, but his protege, Carl Pearson, was a really prominent statistician, did quite a lot of studies of indigenous people and their travels using bones craniometry to neatly categorize people into racial groups to essentially make deductions about different racial groups' characters and make and reinforce that idea that race is this defined process and then can be a hierarchical process essentially. And that idea is very much enshrined in our thinking and has just been something that we can't shake within science and just within our worldview, really, that you belong to a category which is determined by the way you look. And if you don't fit within a category, you have to be placed within one. And then also the normal within that category is generally defined as kind of a whiteness and proximity to. And wherever you go within science, it's just very difficult to shake. So in terms of thinking about decolonizing, there's a slight difference between there's not a slight difference, there's a lot of academic debate about the differences between decoloniality and decolonizing, but in simple terms, a lot of people talk about decoloniality as the process and how you go about some decolonizing, whereas other people think decolonism more in our movement spaces that have been taken into the academy. So this is quite an important quote around that. Decoloniality denotes the ways of thinking, knowing, being and doing that began with but also precede the colonial enterprise and invasion. Implies the recognition and undoing of the hierarchical structures of race, gender, heteropatriarchy and class that continue to control life, knowledge, spirituality and thought, structures that are clearly intertwined intertwined with and constitutive of global capitalism, Western modernity. And I think that really helps people, you know, center what we're all talking about when we're doing this work, because I think often people do lose sight of this. And just to say again, my processes were really re-enshrined about how we think about healthcare when I went to do my master's at London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, another colonial institution set up in 1899, essentially to strengthen the colonial project, because British troops were dying of infectious disease in the across the colonies, and we needed to think, or British troops needed to think of ways to stop that happening. And this has really shaped the research that comes out of the institution, but still the work that they do today and the dynamics of that institution and those spaces, what work gets funded, whose work gets platformed, what issues are considered important and of prominence. And when we think about these huge institutions and the influence they exert on our health and our well-being, we have to think about these legacies and how they continue to manifest, and they are reflecting on these processes, but still we have to think about how these things change. So what do I mean about this? A lot of the time when you go to these institutions, you very much are told to center your health thinking around things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which very much think about development in this terms that countries in the global south are not well developed and they're just underdeveloped due to their own lack of success. And through achieving these goals, we can get them to a point of kind of prosperity, which obviously negates a lot of the history around why some countries are underdeveloped and what's powered to the so-called development of other countries. But it also, we also need to change the epistemologies behind these beliefs, like the idea that, for example, living longer is always what all societies aim for. That's like a very Western concept, to just want to keep going on. Other cultures center, you know, reproduction and having large families, where that's increasingly frowned upon within our society. So just a few more quotes. This one's from Linda Tawa Smith, who is a Maori professor from New Zealand, who wrote Decolonizing Methodologies, and said to decolonize is to acknowledge the often harmful role that colonization has played in distorting knowledge and restructuring our society. Ask how we may dismantle epistemologies derived through colonialism, and instead center the experience of indigenous populations. And I think centering that knowledge, and also realizing that knowledge flow has not always been in one direction. I often talk about the whitewashing of health and science, and this idea that, you know, societies have just been languishing through time, and actually, you know, things like vaccination, immunization were happening globally, you know, thousands and thousands of years, and how not knowing this information really shifts our ideas about who's considered knowledgeable and worthy. Don't want to run out of time, but just a few things. So this image for some people can be quite stark. A lot of people may already be familiar with Sarah Bartman, or Sir G.T. Bartman, who was an individual that belonged to the Khoi tribe, which have their own very complex kind of history in racial hierarchy, but some scientists, very early scientists like Carl Linnaeus, put them as that missing link racially between humans and apes. So they were considered this really inferior tribe. They belonged to that. They were in the Southern Cape. She was exhibited. Many people from this tribe were exhibited over Europe, and we had human zoos in Europe. To up until about 100 years ago. It's not history that is that far away. You can see pictures of human zoos in London in black and white pictures if you go to historical archives. And I think her story is quite striking, because it shows how we've reinforced ideas of certain people's bodies as pathological. She had quite large buttocks in the pictures that they took. This was deemed steatopygia. And with total disregard, she was dissected by a French scientist, and her body was stored in a Parisian museum until the 70s, and it wasn't repatriated into the Southern Cape until Nelson Mandela's presidency. And I think this is just one of so many stories I've come across about human zoos and individuals. There's another story of a fetus, like remains in the Hunterian Museum, another London museum on science. And I think understanding these histories really, it clearly shows how there was a consistent effort to demean and deride groups of people that is ever prevalent today, and it's actually very relevant to now. Which we need to consistently kind of challenge. So just to say that very much my clinical work in the UK centres on the dehumanisation of people within reproductive health services. This is a quote from a book that some people might have read, Heart of the Race, Black Women's Lives in Britain. And there's a chapter that talks about Black women in the NHS. And this says, so you have to take that into account when looking at what happens to us here in Britain. You only have to talk to Black women, the number of us who suffer consequences of bad birth techniques, for example, where the afterbirth is left in and sometimes becomes infected, or the number of us who get sterilised against our wishes because some doctor persuades us to have it done when we go to hospital for something completely different. I think this is just really important for highlighting that these colonial histories are ever present. So this book was written in the 80s, but this is very similar to things that I would hear today, or it's very similar. A lot of the work I do, I collaborate with people globally, very similar to stories that I've heard from Black communities in the US or Indigenous communities in the US. I've connected with Indigenous communities in Canada, for example, or Black communities in Canada, and very similar, narratives around how health institutions are used as tools of oppression, and how health providers are used as tools of oppression. I don't want to take up too much more time, so just to say that there's a deep intertwinement between the legacy of my specialty in eugenics and it being used as a tool of oppression to people. In this country, we've had lots of movements against that. So this is another quote from Heart of the Race, specifically talking about contraceptives being used against Black and working class women in Britain. There were campaigns like Ban the Jab run by OAD. And I think it's really important that we tell these stories of health resistance and health activism that have been really key to shedding light, but also documenting that these things were happening, because without these campaigns, often there would be no evidence that this actually was happening because the institutions cover it up. So just to say, for me, very much like decolonize is really about readdressing existing power structures, but I really do struggle, as I said at the start, because I, as a medical professional, as a doctor, with increasing amounts of power as I go through my training, I'm a gatekeeper, and I'm also part of a system that I recognize is an oppressive system for some people. So I'm very much, trying to navigate and know where my limitations of being able to help those involved in health activism is, and where I need to actually stand back and let people do the work that they need to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annabelle. And also for bringing into the space how living what we perceive as the past is in every part of our infrastructure, even the spaces where we're in the UK, we have a public health system where we're actually most vulnerable and where we're supposed to be taken care of. And so thank you for bringing that to surface, and also uplifting the Heart of the Race. Stella opened our Rehearsing Freedoms Festival, and it was really truly an honor to see that, an honor to have her open up the space, but also to sadly see how prevalent these things still are, and they haven't gone away, in some ways escalated. So thank you so much. I'm going to now bring on Alnor. Alnor Lada's work focuses on the intersections of political organizing, systems thinking, structural change, inner outer mirroring, and narrative work. He was the co-founder and executive co-director of The Rules, a global network of activists, organizers, designers, coders, researchers, writers, and other things focused on changing the rules that create inequality, poverty, and climate change. The Rules started in 2012 as a time-bound project and an experiment in temporary organizational design, exploring new ways of working, playing, and making trouble together. He's currently the co-director of the Transition Resource Circle and the co-author of Post-Capitalist Philanthropy, Healing Wealth in Times of Collapse. Welcome, Alnor.
Thank you. and thank you for having me be part of this. It's an honor. And gratitude to Annabelle for opening us and sharing all that she shared, and the beauty and the grief of all of that. Um, I want to start this conversation first talking about ontology, um, which sounds like a fancy philosophical term, but really is referring to onto, the Greek of for being, sometimes interpreted as vision. So ontology is our perception of the isness of the world, what is reality. And this is related to what Annabelle was talking about, which is, for example, whose bodies matter in the master narrative, where are the delineations of lines between self and other, subject and object. And I want to point to the context that we're in, which some people may call the Anthropocene or late stage capitalism, or in the Indian Vedic tradition, the Kali Yuga, the Dark Ages, or in, for example, the Hopi prophecy, the time of the sixth sun, or the Iroquois prophecy of the time of the seventh fire, or what the alchemical tradition will call the time of the underworld, that we acknowledge that we are in this very dark point in history where humans have lost the ability to be in symbiosis with the living planet. And without acknowledging this, when we talk about healing or freedom, we can easily jump into narratives of ascension and spiritual bypass. But we are locked in a core of beliefs, of worldviews, of ontologies that are totalizing. Abdullah Öcalan, the founder of the PKK, the Kurdish resistance in the Middle East, and the founder of Rojava, the autonomous community between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, talks about the current superstructure as capitalist modernity. That we cannot talk about capitalism as a political economic system in absence of talking about modernity as a social cultural construct, and the two are one project. And this master narrative of capitalist modernity is fed by what I call the unholy trinity, which is separation, materialism, and rationalism. Separation is the idea that humans are somehow outside of the evolutionary ecology, that we somehow sit on top of this pyramid of life. And historically, the idea of dualism, the idea that the human mind is this godlike creature within this animalistic body, which was then transferred to all conceptions of the other, the female body, the indigenous body, the black body, the brown body, and the white male Christian sat on top of that hierarchy. This separation is still at the core of the source code of capitalist modernity. There is no such thing as historical colonialism. There's only the ongoing coloniality of late stage capitalism, and it's embedded in this idea of separation. The other two legs of this triangle are first materialism, the idea that the entire world can be reduced to its material constituents. The entire world can be reduced to the atom, and the atom to the neutron, and the proton and the electron, and now with quantum physics, the photon or the quasar or the quanta or what have you. And then the rationalism part of this is not only can we reduce the entire material world to its constituent parts, but that we are entitled to do so with the human mind, with our limited human neocortex. And this trinity of separation, materialism, and rationalism is the core ontological imprint. And many of us will inherently understand this and have read and researched these things. But what I want to say is that this ontology is not some external philosophy out there, that it has been manifested into the very construction of the material world. All aspects of our lives are now mediated by capital, by an invented debt-based fiat currency that was imposed by colonialist powers and now determines almost every aspect of our lives, where we grew up, who our neighbors were, what we do for a living, if we have access to leisure time, our thoughts, our behaviors, our manner of dress, our codes of conduct, our cultural mores are all being co-determined by this ontology. And this ontology also marries itself with a memetics. By memetics, I'm referring to like the core root of this, which is meme, which was a term coined by Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene in 1979. And meme is, we now use it colloquially to refer to lolcats or what have you. But it refers to the base cultural unit of an idea. It's the cultural equivalent of a gene. And these memes are communicable, like diseases, like viruses. And they are passed from person to person through culture itself. So we could say we deny the ontologies of capitalist modernity, and yet there is mimetic real estate that is taken in our body through these thought forms and enacted on a daily basis through our interaction and our complicity with the dominant culture. So decolonization is not just a theoretical practice that requires the mind. It has to be integrated at a cellular level, at a somatic level, at a communal level, at a spiritual level, at a superstructural level. We can say that we deny the invisible hand, but there is an invisible hand that lives within all of us. As Steve Biko, the great anti-apartheid activist, once said, the base station of capitalism lives within our minds. And so I want to offer an alternative ontology, an alternative trinity, which is animism, relationalism, and interbeing. I argue that animism is the antidote to base materialism. That when we understand and integrate and internalize that not only the world, but the cosmos itself is alive and is in dialogue with us, that requires something else of us. It requires reciprocity, consent, conversation, the asking of permission. And the praxis of animism, by its very existence, undermines materialist reductionist scientific thought. And this is not to say that science is bad and animism is good, but to say that science is one way of seeing the world. It is the floor of understanding in a certain agreed upon circular logic, but it is not the ceiling of understanding. So we can engage in the practice of the scientific method without making it the arbiter of all truth. I will also argue that relationalism and relationality are the antidote to rationality. But we're not trying to amputate rationalism, but we're pointing to a trans-rationalism, which its primacy is relationships themselves. David Abram, in The Spell of the Sensuous, says, there is no such thing as objective truth. There's only the quality of relationships, which is in some ways a paraphrase of the Pan-African and South African conception of Ubuntu, which is we are who we are through others. There's no truth outside of the interbecoming of kinship and relationships with humans and the more than human realms. And finally, the logic of separation, the antidote to that is the logic of interbeing, or what Indy Johar calls interbecoming. That there is no locus of control centered at the individual. that we are a congress of life entangled in an ecology of becoming and being. The very idea of the rationalist individual being able to make decisions and enact their will over the world is part of the fallacy of so-called Enlightenment logic. We're now discovering from neurobiology that we have these very powerful biomes that in our stomachs that have that include more foreign bacteria than human bacteria. So even the neat, tidy understanding of the human is being displaced. That we have this vagus nerve that comes from our stomach to our brain that tells our brain the quality of our thoughts, which is dependent not only with what we eat, but the bacteria that is fermented and created in this interaction of what we are eating. We're learning from quantum physics that we are entangled in a codeterminant universe, that time itself is undulating in ways beyond traditional linearity and temporality that we can probably never understand, that there is non-locality and bilocation of cells and atoms that are happening simultaneously. And so our notions of time and fixity are being disrupted. From genetics, what we're understanding is that all the we understand of modern genetics has come traditionally since the Human Genome Project from 7% of DNA, what scientists call junk DNA. And now they're understanding that this majority DNA, this 93% of our DNA, actually is pulsing an electromagnetic force equivalent to how organs project electromagnetic force. And so in a very real sense, our ancestors are living through us. And so the fundaments of separation materialism and rationalism are giving way to a more animistic, relational, interbecoming, quantum queer worldview. And that is going to require new superstructures, what I point to as sort of post-capitalism, which is not to say it's another ism that comes after capitalism. It's not another temporal state, but it's created and co-created through the enactment, socialization, and entrainment of values such as solidarity, empathy, reciprocity, cooperation, and a commitment to the living world, and understanding that ontology itself is at the core of the political struggle. That there is no separation between the inner work and the outer work. That we are running out of political solutions, and we must open the vistas to mystical solutions. What ontology and memetics teach us is that the manner by which we approach is more important than the thing we think we're approaching. The manner by which we approach is more important than the thing we think we're approaching, because we have no idea what we think we're approaching outside of our colonized, conditioned viewpoint of a separate materialist world made of dead, inanimate, inert matter that we are entitled to control and enact in our anthropocentric will. And this is the core we need to challenge. It is beyond policies and solutions and requests to the nation state and our behaviors as citizens objects in a consumerist paradigm, what I would call, what Hakim Bey calls the live, work, consume paradigm of capitalist modernity. And I want to just end by sharing a brief excerpt of a poem from Hafez, the great Sufi poet. And he says, "I have come into this world to see this, the sword drop from men's hands, even at the height of their arc of anger, because we have finally realized there is just one flesh to wound, and it is the beloved's. There is just one flesh to wound, and it is the beloved's." And I think that's extremely relevant, given the atrocities and the ethnic cleansing and the genocide that is happening in Palestine sanctioned by the imperialist Zionist Western states. There's just one flesh to wound, and it is the beloved's.
Thank you so much, Alnor, and also for drawing out how much everything that we want to transform is being lived already inside of us, and how much there is a invitation to practice and train differently. So thank you so much. I'm going to now invite Pat and do a little intro to Pat. Pat McCabe, Woman Stands Shining, is a Dene Navajo mother, grandmother, activist, artist, writer, ceremonial leader, and international speaker. She is a voice for global peace, and her paintings are created as tools for individual earth and global healing. She draws upon the indigenous sciences of thriving life to reframe questions of sustainability and balance. She is devoted to supporting the next generation women's nation and men's nation in being functional members of the hoop of life and upholding the honor of being human. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Farzana, and thanks for this beautiful event. Thank you for the honor of being a part of it and really appreciating the relatives that went before me. So thank you. I actually would like to begin by singing a song. So one hallmark of Indigenous peoples, I think we can say, is that we often hear that they hold creation stories. How did all this begin? How did human beings arrive here? But I want to propose that we are continuously telling the creation story. It didn't just it wasn't a one-time event. And so in that sense, I feel like we're on this journey together. So I want to sing a traveling song for us collectively as we move along as fellow travelers here. So way-ya, way-oh, way-oh, hey-ya, way-oh, way-oh, hey-ya, way-oh, way-ya, way-oh, way-ya, way-oh, way-oh, hey-ya, way-oh, way-oh, hey-ya, way-oh, way-ya, way-oh, 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 way-ya, way-oh. Way-oh, 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 way-ya, way-oh, way-oh, hey-ya, way-oh, way-oh, hey-ya, way-oh, way-ya, way-oh, way-ya, way-oh, way-oh, hey-ya, way-oh, way-oh, hey-ya, way-oh, way-ya, way-oh. Way-oh, 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 way-oh. So I also would have us notice that we're not solo travelers appearing out of nowhere from nothing. That we're actually traveling in a line of generations. So maybe some people have heard the idea that that 7 generations are to be considered in all of our actions and activities. But also, I would propose that we might benefit. I benefit from seeing myself as traveling within 7 generations. So sometimes we're looking at 7 generations forward. I think that's how that principle is thought about mostly. But sometimes I see myself as the middle generation of the 7. So I have the 3 behind me, myself, and 3 ahead of me. So I always use this kind of gesture to describe that. So I'm always traveling. I'm traveling as a pack, really, all the time. And so I want to invoke from my lineage, and here I'll introduce myself the way we do. I come from Dene Nation by blood, and I was adopted into the Lakota spiritual way of life by spiritual practice. And then the two have kind of come together, and more has been added. But traditionally, we introduce ourselves by our clan. So I'll say She'e'ia, Tachi Nishli, Aro Ashi Bashishi, Ma'adishkeshne Dashanale, Klaus Chidao Shiche, Akwata was Dani Nishli. So also acknowledging the traveling, the creation, the co-creation of my forebears in terms of my clan, and their related way to all the other clans of within my people. So just noticing that about myself, that I'm not here alone at all. I can't be, not in time or in space. And so I want to name that recently, recently I've taken on the stewardship on behalf of Dene Nation of some land at the base of one of our 4 sacred mountains, which is a movement that's occurring in what we now call the United States, and I'm sure in other places as well, where land is actively being restored to the stewardship of indigenous peoples. And so I want to name that recently we had some seeds returned to us that we hadn't, these were corn seeds that were returned to us that we hadn't had since before our treaties, since before the attempted genocide, let's say. And it was really, it was so moving, but it made me, again, think about time and space in a different way, because I said, those seeds, we were co-evolving with those seeds. So we say in modern science, I guess we might say that we're cultivating strains of seeds for our purposes, for the characteristics that benefit us the most. But I'm going to say that the seeds also can cultivate us, can cultivate our way of thinking and being, and our understanding of the construct that we're in, this powerfully interrelated, interdependent construct that is this Mother Earth. And so I was really thinking about what it means to co-evolve with these seeds. And I thought, wow, these seeds knew us at a time when the deep trauma wasn't a dominant factor in our nervous system. When our way of life was really thriving, and maybe we could say at its peak. Although I don't know if my elders would look at it in terms of that hierarchy. But I thought, how special to now be able to plant these non-traumatized seeds and to come to them again and to ask, my question, my prayer, and my part of the participating in this was, you knew us before, and I'm asking you to help me feel and to know, what was our love like before? Because our love had to have been very different than the way love manages to find its expression through traumatized mind, heart, body, spirit, through the trauma of attempted genocide. And so I'm thinking also about the travelers that way. And then the 3 generations ahead, my prayer often there is to say, You who are already living the solution to the issues, to the problems that we are facing right now, we're looking for you. We're calling out for you. So I ask you to sing back to us from that place, as all of our activities now, and all of my ancestors' activities, all of our ancestors' activities were devoted to furthering our lives. What I'm doing here, what I'm engaging in now, what I'm bringing into my field of consciousness, what I'm holding as my belief, this was the soil that you grew from as you moved towards solution. So I'm asking you to sing back so I can hear you and find you, and so that I can travel, towards you and show me the way. So this is maybe another way of looking at 7 generations. So I wanted to move through a little bit from what I heard from both of our amazing speakers. I wanted to look at this idea of decolonizing curriculum. I know that was embedded in a lot of other thoughts, but it really struck me. Because I come from a family of people who were deeply embedded in some high academics. My father went to Stanford University, my brother, my daughter, my niece, my nephew, and I was sent to one of the most prestigious prep schools in the United States, Phillips Exeter Academy, when I was young. And therefore, I refused to go to Stanford University afterwards. I'm like, I've had enough. Thank you. But anyways, so I was at a gathering in India, an Indigenous peoples gathering in India, and part of the process, along with cultural ceremonies, cultural sharing of cultural dance and song and art and activities, but there was also this part about the presentation of the white papers, and this was new for me in a Indigenous peoples gathering. And so one night during the gathering, my spirit helpers came to me, and they were, every now and then, they're very adamant. They're like shaking me. They're like, "Hey," and they were saying, "There's something you need to say about this tomorrow." And so the next day, I went in and found an opportunity to stand up in front of this very large gathering. And what I was told to say about it was this: that we, so in this case, we as Indigenous people, whose knowledge has traditionally been held, enacted, expressed in ways that are very different than how it is done in academia, that we have to be careful there. And so this is also the story of colonization, of you had ologists, anthropologists, archaeologists, etc. You had ologists observing you and then going back, and from their own lens, from their own worldview, from their own experience of being human, began to write and tell the world about Indigenous peoples. And sometimes they were way, way off in terms of what we understand ourselves to be, and why we were doing what we were doing, and how we do what we do. And that's understandable that would happen. So we had a deep desire to correct that image at some point. And now it's come to this fierce reclamation in the form of saying, you don't have the right to write about us. We'll write about ourselves. We'll tell our own story to the world. And so what the spirit was saying to me that night was, they said, but be careful here, because you're taking something that is living, embodied, interrelational with beings, trees, stones, water, flying ones, swimming ones, creepy crawling ones, four-legged ones, that do not express through intellect, do not express through word, do not express through writing. And you're taking all of that experience and relationality and co-creation capacity, and you are trying to put it through this very tight, I'm going to call it, mechanism of expression, academia, right? And so what happens there is when you begin to explain these living phenomena conceptually, it can become easy to lose the truth of the living relationality. It becomes fixed. It becomes, in some ways, lifeless. And it loses its power and its potency. So people who have been separated from that way of being human, that interrelational way with understanding ourselves not only as part of Earth, but as Earth, those people might not know the difference between the living ceremony, let's call it, for instance, and the writing about the ceremony. But what's important is for you as Indigenous people, you have to remember the difference. And if you get too involved with conceptualizing through this mechanism of academia, these living practices, pretty soon you're gonna lose track and you will no longer have access to these living practices. And this will be a tragedy. This will become a tragedy for this whole earth. If all the branches of humanity begin to conceptualize that, in Lakota, we call it Takawakanshkanshkan, that sacred movement, the movement of sacred encounter, where things are continually encountering each other. And every time they encounter each other, something new possibilities are presented. So that is actually the structure of Earth. It's not only an interbeing of deep relationality, but it's also a construct of encounter and birth, the birthing of new possibilities. This is a structure. So when we think of structure, often, and especially in academia, we want to pin it down. We want to be able to weigh it, measure it, science as well. Repeat it. That's the clincher. You got to be able to repeat it. We want to pretend that this construct is fixed, but it isn't. It's a continuous opening, creative possibility, and that is its structure. But it's a structure that is not fixed. So I wanted to say that around this idea of decolonizing curriculum, because I question myself whether we can put this medicine through that lens. I think I have enough time to express one other thing here. So Dr. Greg Kahete, who is an Indigenous scholar here, lives down the road from me, he wrote a book called Native Science. And in that book, he talks about how, he was puzzled when he was reading what the ologists had to say about their encounter with us. They were saying, they called us primitive and childlike people. And so what I loved about him is he was saying, there is a system of thought going on over there that causes those people, when they see us, to think of those words. I wonder what it is. So he went in and, looking through his lens, he believes that most of these ologists who came to observe and write about us early on were actually English aristocratic men. So he said, maybe if I understood their culture, I would understand why this phenomenon happens. So as he's trying to observe them through his lens, what he thinks he sees is up until the age of 5, they're allowed to sing, dance, play, pretend to their heart's delight. But at the age of 5, that gets stopped by and large. And from that point on, the primary activity of the educated aristocratic man in England is to hone the intellect. This becomes the primary, really the solitary way of knowing anything. So when these gentlemen come to what we now call the United States or North America, they're observing Indigenous peoples. What are we doing? We're singing, we're dancing, we're visioning, we're fasting, we're having conversations with things they don't believe you can have a conversation with. We're seeing things that they don't see. And so their only conclusion is these must be a primitive and childlike people. Even their grown men are involved in the activities that are really relegated only to children. Well, a big light bulb went off for me when I read that. I thought, wow, that explains about 10 million things, right? Because that colonization and that dominance of that way of being human and knowing anything spread across the entire planet quite quickly and was imposed upon human beings everywhere. But what I want to finish with is saying that, what I've been saying lately is if sustainability is the highest and most sought after technology on the planet, who should we be talking to? We should be talking to those peoples who've known how to live in one place over an extended period of time, 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 10,000 years, 20,000 years in relative health, harmony, and happiness. Because these are the true scientists of sustainability. The proof's in the pudding for them and their existence, right? And so I say, is it an accident that these people, we call these people indigenous, they are of place, that at that depth. Is it an accident that these peoples have this level of sustainability and have a broad spectrum of ways of knowing? I'm going to say no. So for me, I take it as a logistical fact, I guess I'll say, that having a broad spectrum of ways of knowing beyond intellect, being able to use this full instrument of perception to gain knowledge, gives us a capacity to have a kind of relationship with place and all of the rest of the life forms, often represented here. Every single life form gets a seat on the sacred hoop of life. That's we have to have a capacity beyond intellect. And I always say, try having a romance with intellect only. Tell me how it goes. So really, I don't even like that word sustainability. I like the idea of having a mad love affair. If I'm going to be a primarily relational being in a relational construct, then let it be a mad love affair. So I'll stop there and say thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat, and particularly the reminder to this ongoing encounter of birthing and possibility. So thank you so much. I'm going to now invite us to, Pat, you, for folks who know us, know that I'm like a nerd for numbers and numerology, and you kept speaking to 7, and so maybe inviting us to a 7-minute break, and then we'll resume for questions. And I'll also invite our speakers to maybe draw out things from one another, because we can definitely see the crossovers between you all. So we'll come back at 25 past, and we'll resume. So please hydrate, do what you need to do, integrate. There's a lot that's been shared, and take a beat. We'll see you at 25. Oh, and we have a question for you if you want to put it in the chat. What are you currently rehearsing or practicing? I think the music is gently concluding and nudging us back. So just inviting you to settle. And if you are coming back, a few answers to what people are practicing. We've got listening and learning with the body, somatic healing, reclaiming my spiritual self, which was repressed by organized religion. Also for our speakers, there's a lot of love on the YouTube for you all on the live stream, which I don't think you're getting to experience or feel. But there's some of them the team have passed on to you so you can see in the chat. I'm going to now invite all of our speakers back on to screen so we can have about a half an hour, 35-minute conversation. So just inviting Annabelle, Pat, and Alnor to be on screen, and team will pin you. So we're together on the screen. Great. I wanted to welcome you all back and maybe start with, if I can see many crossovers between what you all touched on, but just to have a moment if there was something that you felt was incomplete or someone else spoke to that you wanted to draw out, or that if you had a question for one another before I field you some of the questions that we've got for you. So just making a little bit of space between you all to connect or even reflect.
Yeah, I have some points of reflection, and I really grateful for Pat's thoughts at the end. So I think in terms of, and it's something I'm very much navigating because I'm, in my PhD research at the moment. And as I said, I navigate all of these spaces as an organizer, as, a clinician, but then, outside of these spaces. And I think it is really important to understand how sometimes academia distorts, or being in certain institutions distorts not just our work, but our view of self. And you have to be mindful of who you're catering to, and the purpose of like your work and your research and things like that. So when we go into spaces and we say that we're going to try to, I don't know, look at the environment or something from a decolonial lens or something like that, inherently in those institutions, there are levels of acceptability and understandings of self, and you have to fit your work through a certain medium in order for them to be able to be assessed, for it to be quantifiable, markable, and that limits our knowledge at baseline. And I think that is really important to also understand in these processes, and something that I'm trying to manage. I'd also just say that in terms of my writing, a bit in my book, I pick up on things from my own culture and how they've been distorted. So looking at particularly West African traditions of like Abia and Juju, and how people talk about them today, in terms of being kind of like demonic or black magic, and how that's looking at them particularly through the Christian lens really distorted what those knowledge systems are. And even today within my family, they're very much still understood through a Western Christian lens. So like if I try to explain, what Juju was in terms of a worldview and a knowledge system, people are just completely unwilling to grasp that, and there's just evidence of that everywhere. So I just thought I'd bring in another example of like how that applies, I suppose, within my own life, and how I've tried to shift my own approach to that, because growing up I very looked upon that something demonic. That's how I was taught about it. And then when I went to do my own research, I obviously realized it was looked upon by a very specific lens, and it was much more complicated than that. It was about the body, it was about healing, it was about health.
You look like you're going to come on.
Oh, I guess I've been unmuted the whole time, but thank you, Annabelle. Yes. So I think something that bridges maybe what you're just saying, and also what I heard Alnor say, You know, in ceremony, one time I was told, and this was related to the energetic of masculine and feminine, but I was told, you think you know what masculine is, but you don't. And you think you know what feminine is, but you don't. All you know is how those energetics behave in this modern world paradigm, in this power over paradigm construct, I'll say. And they said, but if you were to plug those energetics into a different paradigm, they would behave in a completely different way. And so what I was thinking about when you were speaking, Alnur, so they're thinking about the paradigm of academics, when everything that we are, all of our somatics, all of our, this incredible sensory instrument that we are very, very sensitive to. You wouldn't know it by the way we act in the world today, but it's very, very sensitive. It's not really built for what we're doing right now, which is part of the issue that we're having, right? But I was thinking, Elnora, when you talked about your unholy trinity of separation, materialism, and rationalism, you know, it helps me when I expand that. And so that's how we have been allowed to express the possibility of being human, primarily. Well, only recently, actually, in modern world paradigm, is through those lenses. But if we were to direct our humanity into other lenses, then who would we be then? And so that's a question that I'm always working with, and that also goes to this idea that you brought up about, you know, it's sort of it's originating in our intellect and in our mind. I think at one point you were talking about, and I guess for me, I'll say it originates in our belief, right? I do a huge amount of belief work, and the belief work for me is what helps me, hopefully this is a good use of the word, transcend the current belief, the current, you know, being the fish in the water. So it allows me to expand on what's it like to become amphibious. You know, what's it like to maybe burrow down into the earth below the ocean, you know? So I get to have this opportunity to expand. And I think that this also speaks to how in modern world paradigm, it's, well, the power over paradigm, is very important to understand who has the power, how much power you have, and not to lose your power, because this is food, clothing, and shelter. It's a very violent situation, right? And so in that construct, knowing is imperative. You're supposed to know. You're supposed to know. You're supposed to be in control. Even though, as I talked about earlier, we're in this dynamic structure of encounter that's bringing new possibilities continuously, but we're pretending that we can be fixed. But it's not. And so I think modern world paradigm has a really hard time with that, the unknown and the unknowable. But in both of my cultures that I operate out of, Dene and Lakota, and in Lakota, there's this concept of the great mystery, and it's a given. So I always say that, you know, when you begin your science believing that you can know everything, you get completely different results than when you go into your science knowing there is no way to know everything. I am one receiver in this human body of infinite, I mean, so many different possibilities for receiving that make up the whole of this organism we call Earth. There's no way I can know or perceive it all. I can contribute my part to it, but I can't know it all. And so that creates a very different understanding of what human presence means, yeah, as being part of this organism.
Laura, would you like to pick up on anything before I field you some questions?
No, I think, yeah, let's go to questions. I appreciate what Pat is sharing and what Annabelle is sharing, and yeah, I'm fermenting with it.
Okay, great. So we've got a question, which is, in a time, and you can see it also in the chat, in a time where so many folks are so certain in the rightness of their ideas, and this is on many fronts, but I'm thinking about white supremacist, materialist, rationalist views, source code, as Alnor referred to, How can we create spaces for grappling with ontological transitions we need in a time of, sorry, it just escaped me. And deep divisions, who is trusted to hold those spaces? I guess a follow-on from that is, how do we have more capacious conversations, grapple with the entangled? Go.
I'll just say one thing here about I guess how this relates to my reproductive justice work. I think at the center of when we talk about decolonizing is the idea that there is not one way of knowing. When we talk about global majorities and cultures outside that of the kind of dominant oppressive idea, and we've spoken about this reinforcement that there's one way of knowing and how integral that's been. I think struggles that really challenge that, so when we look at trans liberation, that's incredibly threatening, because that's an acceptability that there cannot be one way of knowing, and how that goes against everything that we've been taught about being binary, and that's very threatening. So I think in terms of having these conversations and making spaces where people are willing to accept that there isn't a singular truth, that's very, very threatening to the overall enterprise of colonial oppression. So that really goes to the heart of the struggle, really. People don't want to make space for dual ways of understanding and pluriversal interpretation, because that is hugely threatening. I'll let the others answer.
Pat, would you like to go?
Oh, I'd love to hear your thoughts on there, if you don't mind.
What was coming to me was this line that I was gifted by a plant much more intelligent than myself, where the plant said to me, ignorance is the seed of all ontology. That was the first line. Ignorance is the seed of all ontology. And the second line was, the midwife of this seed is humility. So what it was trying to tell me, from my limited understanding, is that when we start to grapple and contemplate our ignorance, this becomes the midwife of humility, and from humility comes wisdom, right? Just sitting with the consequences of what it is to prop up one Western body, the 2,000, 3,000 calories a day, the iPhones, the computers, the paved cement roads, the automobiles, the fossil fuel, globalized extraction infrastructure, supply chains, all of that. If we could even just get a glimpse of that for a moment, we would drop to our knees in awe and horror. And when we enter this state of humility as the midwife of this ignorance, then wisdom and knowledge can at least attempt to enter our spheres and our fields. And in the question of, well, the others are holding such certainty, white supremacists, rationalists, academics, etc. But the very act of us on the other side of the debate, entering that space of humility, it's not to just simply be in the state of uncertainty and ambiguity and not knowing. Part of what I'm saying with ontology and the manner by which we approach is that by opening this space of humility, right, by putting our head to the soil as an equivalent and as important as a strategy than creating some rationalist policy plan, asking the ancestors for help, asking the mountain for direction, these are strategies that are inherently laced with humility. And that is going to open up superpositions of possibility we can't even imagine. And we don't do these things in order to open up these vistas. They become a consequence of being able to hold the negative capability, from being able to not be seduced by this Occidental need for answers and problem solution and will over. And something else will emerge. And those who hold very strong beliefs, their beliefs will crumble in the face of that. And their beliefs are already crumbling. I think even the idea of certainty, and we hold it as it's some finite thing, but just in academia itself, I pointed to just 3 or 4 fields where certainty is crumbling through quantum physics, neurobiology, evolutionary anthropology, etc. And then, of course, the very ecology of Pachamama, of the living world, is changing in response to our ignorance. And so the world is mirroring back the state we're in. And the more of us that claim these relationships with what Pat refers to and Lakota peoples refer to as the great mystery, that becomes the opening, because that is the salvo for the dialogue to begin.
So, as I was saying earlier, in the power over paradigm, in which you must have power over another in order to have what you need. Again, power shifts are important. So on the one hand, there are different ethics that arise from different places that tell us it's wrong to be concerned with power. Obviously, not everybody thinks that, but some people do. But I say it's legitimate in this paradigm. And so anytime we pull out any one member, so if we try to talk about men, or you try to talk about Black people, or you try to talk about, immediately there's this resistance, because I think the reason is because we say, well, where does that leave me? Am I losing positionality by entertaining this inquiry around one part of our human family? Because if I'm losing power, in some of the ceremonies, some of the indigenous elders have been saying the women are going to lead. So that's a very provocative statement in this structure, right? It's like, well, so anybody who doesn't identify as a woman is like, well, hold on a second, where does that leave me? I'm already struggling in here. Like, I'm really struggling in here. And suddenly I'm getting the ground pulled out from under me. So what am I supposed to do? What do we say? So I just want to acknowledge that that's the playing field, first of all, that we operate under oftentimes, that we're subjected to in many ways, but also that we have agreed to. And so it's hard to think outside of that. And this is why it's hard to create the spaces. Like part of the question was, who do we trust to hold such a space? Because whoever has the floor, so to speak, is being given an inordinate amount of power, maybe we could say, or is coming from their perspective, which changes the dynamic of the conversation. So I just want to acknowledge that dynamic. And so I'll say that, in traditional communities or in indigenous communities, where hierarchy has actually served, in the sense that we can say we have elders. There are elders that we witness that live, that their way of life seems to create harmony. Their way of life seems to create abundance for the whole. Their way of life seems to create peace among us. We have a possibility of coming to them and asking them to host a conversation. And that's not part of the structure of power over paradigm so much, right? and so I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking that, you know, one of the ways that is, when held correctly, it's kind of a loaded word, but when held correctly, the ceremony is a place to come where we acknowledge that we're secondary to other forces, to fire, to water, to song, to movement, to spirit beings, etc. That's a place to come and inquire. And this is also something that's hard to come by in modern world paradigm. But I'm going to say that perhaps one place where this is what I tried to do, is I was trying to set up a communal moon lodge for my town, where women could go during that time of their sacred way that they bring of menstruation. I thought, wow, we have so many power dynamics among the women. How can we learn how to just allow each other so that we can have this space? And my thought was that we should have ongoing talking circle or listening circle, where the hierarchy is downplayed, where everything is placed in the center for everyone to look at. We're not debating, we're not addressing each other. We're just bringing the part of what we hold to whatever question is being posed, and then everybody walks away. So that might be a possibility for how to hold a space like that.
Thank you so much. I have another question. I'm now being sent them on my phone, so I'll just read them off my phone. And this one is that we're constantly being pushed into binaries, and many of you touched on this, and borders, and we hold deep pain and trauma. What are some of the ways that we can practice in real time being in right relationship with each other? And I think you've all touched on it, but maybe to deepen and expand.
Maybe I'll say a little bit about a continuation of memetics and framing. I really admire the work of Culture Hack Labs, which is an activist collective that does deep framing work. And they often talk about syntropic frames. So syntropy is the opposite of entropy, the opposite of breakdown and degradation. Syntropy is symbiotic and harmonic. And so what we have to acknowledge is that English is an inherently binary oppositional language. It is an us versus them language. It is no coincidence that the scientific revolution and quote unquote enlightenment were born from primarily the English language, of course, French and German as well, but primarily the English language, as was the Industrial Revolution, as was colonialism, imperialism, genocide and enslavement, and patriarchy and white supremacy. They're embedded within the very structures and confines of the language itself. And the language is also very noun-based, right? It's like 60 or 70% nouns, people's, places, things. And so it creates the thingification of reality. Teokas and Ghost Horse, who's an elder, Lakota elder, and Pat and I know very well, he often talks about how old Lakota is a language of primarily verbs. And when you have a verb language, like you don't say the storm is coming, you would say storming or whatever the equivalent is. And that then ensconces humans and those engaged in dialogue in an animistic, participatory cosmos. It's a very different way to verbally engage with the world. And so when we're faced with these binaries, what I try to think about is what would be the verbed approach to this? What would be the type of language that transcends subject-object dualities within this? As well as like, what's the syntropic frame? So, for example, the us versus them frame, a syntropic frame would be something like, our healing is bound together. So this is a horizontal metaphor. It's not a vertical metaphor. my healing is not linearly coming from your healing, but they are bound together. They are entwined. They're entangled. They're non-causal, but causally dependent simultaneously. And it's a very simple phrase, and yet it holds so much. And I think language is, I wouldn't say necessarily the primary vector, but I would say a central vector for collaboration.
Just kind of building on that, in terms of everybody kind of sitting in their silos and also being told that you have to divide yourself into these neat categories. When we started Reproductive Justice Initiative, we were initially a collective, so Decolonizing Contraception Collective, and all working in the sexual reproductive space, but coming from very different spaces, whether that's being, you know, a writer, a poet that focuses on that area, whether that's a clinician, whether that's doing outreach work with communities. And I think just like Healing Justice Collective, I think collectivism and collaboration is really key, because there were so many things that we're never going to have the exact same opinion or worldview, and that's really not the point of all of these conversations. If anything, it's so that we can live in a state of harmony and understanding and reciprocity and seeing each other's humanity. And I think there was a lot of sharing that took place. So one of my colleagues is from a Tamil community, and when we spoke about like sexuality and reproductive health, she was very much like, okay, we don't have words for some of these parts, right? So when I'm trying to do workshops for my community or talk about some of these ideas, and you know, we did something with an organization that she's collaborated with about like child abuse and things like that. She was like, this is really difficult because we don't have languages to describe these things or these acts, and it's really limiting of the conversation I'm trying to have. And there were nuances that I just couldn't have ever understood. There were other things we talked about, like the experience of having like period parties, and I think it just gave me a completely different outlook on my work and what I do that I would just never have if I tried to do this work in a silo. And I think we haven't really talked much, well, we've just touched upon about individualism, but I think there's a lot around what we've talked about, which gears you psychologically in this society to work as an individual for individual accolades and praise. And it's really counterproductive to achieving a lot of the aims that we've discussed. So for me, that's really central, like finding a community of people and accepting that there is knowledge flow between you, but then there's also points of disagreement is quite key.
So I think, you know, as I'm listening to the questions, I'm feeling like they're kind of calling for some maybe concrete suggestions in some ways. And so I'll just say for myself, I'm hearing that, and I honor that. And I also feel that, you know, once I have my compass pointed correctly, or in some intentional, recognizable direction, that's what I mean by correctly, for myself, then everything that I do or create or participate in is guided by that. So I feel like getting intention, belief, consciousness, that awareness is the key to everything else that we might want to attempt. So I'll just name that. So I feel like I'm speaking from a philosophical perspective oftentimes, as people are asking for maybe more concrete suggestion. But here I'm going to name a couple things. So I think it's well, one, overarching. I want to say, you know, willingness is coming. It's already coming out of necessity. And so for me, it's daunting, don't get me wrong. And there's a lot that I wonder about for sure. But I just feel like the beauty of this time coming is that what works is going to work. And what do I mean by work? What causes life to be furthered, that's going to become a bottom line thing. And so all of the theories, all of the dogmas, all of the everything eventually gets put to the test around how does this cause life to thrive, or does it? And so I feel like, willingness is coming upon us, and so sometimes I've said, contrary to Albert Einstein, I would say we do have to simultaneously prepare for war and peace. War meaning taking a stand for life, taking a stand for upholding the honor of being human being. While simultaneously, as willingness comes, as realities are being becoming undeniable, our counters, I won't go so far as to say our enemies, but our counters may suddenly have realizations and say, oh my gosh, I did not know. And so on the one hand, we stand firmly in this upholding the honor of being human being, of honoring life, and stand resolutely in that. But when that moment comes, we also have to be willing to take in the movement of someone coming to realization. And someone might have to do that for me too. So that requires a spiritual capacity, to be able to shift from one stance to the other with some fluidity. So I feel like it's a good idea, if you haven't already, to begin that practice of, and it is a release of dogma, and I'm going to say humility is a factor in there. I also feel like the willingness to really take in, that everything I do affects every other part of this life structure. That's a huge responsibility. And we have not been operating under that understanding, even though science is coming upon a time when it's noticing this. Gosh, it seems like when we do this over here, it affects that over there. It's like, yeah, it is. And so that's where that the phrase mitakuye oyasin, for all my relations, comes in. It's saying I have an accountability to that. I have an accountability to what my actions are, because it's affecting everything, whether I like it or not, whether I intend it to or not. And so it's a pretty immature place to pretend that that's not what this structure is. And so I think for me, that creates a different kind of willingness again to engage in different ways, non-binary way, perhaps. And then I guess I'll just maybe stop by saying, in many traditions, spiritual traditions, forgiveness is always a piece of it, and that's what I've been told, that if we can, so many times when our autonomy, our sovereignty has been violated, we move to vengeance. We're certainly witnessing that in many directions all over this planet. And but if we can forego that and at least come to neutrality, come to the place of, okay, fine, that happened, whatever, I'm going to move on. That's a big move. But when we can actually arrive at forgiveness, what I've been told is that spiritually, that releases a kind of medicine, a kind of energetic, a kind of opening of possibility in many dimensions, and even throughout cosmos. And so that's for me an area of study, to try to understand what do we really mean when we talk about forgiveness. And that is one of the tools of being a traveler at this time of the Kali Yuga, of the underworld, and all those places that you spoke of, Alnor. Like there's a specific set of tools for being one of the ones who agreed to travel during this time. And I'll say, for me, in my cosmology, every one of us sitting here is an amazing, I'll say warrior, because you would not be here right now if there wasn't something that you came to bring. And so I'll also say, this is the moment that's bringing to bear why you thought you should be here now, what the agreement is. And for me, that can be helpful, and also helpful meeting others, the other stop there.
Thank you so much, Pat. And it reminds me that you recently said to a few of us, like when we gather, we have to ask, what is the assignment? And so also just bringing that into the space. I'm mindful of time and wanting to honor people's time. So, but instead of kind of abruptly ending, I just want to check in. Do any of you have any like final or concluding conversations? These conversations are oceanic in a lot of ways, and we just like skimmed over it. But is there anything that you would like to add before I kind of try and take us to conclusion? Annabelle, Alnor, Pat?
No, I think Pat's voice is a good way to end, as she also brought us in.
Perfect. I just want to take a moment to thank you all, and also everyone who's joined us this evening. I also want to, I know that team will be putting in links for future things and also places that they can follow up on your work, so that the inquiry and the curiosity can continue. So I know that's happening on the live stream. I also want to remind folks that we have a collective community practice space every day at 1 p.m. that Lana Homeri holds. So this invitation to practice, we have that. And also, Pat, you touched on forgiveness. And one of the reasons we use this frame of rehearsal was to create more capacity around pre-forgiveness as we move together. What would it mean that if we use the frame of rehearsal, that we weren't seeking any form of perfection, but we were grappling with practice in this moment. So thank you for bringing that in. I want to just thank you all and invite you to hydrate as always and to be continued somewhere else. Thank you.